The Epstein File, a nation's silence built on power, privilege, and politics. Why both Republicans and Democrats are resisting Epstein File release, and what victims still demand. Since Jeffrey Epstein's arrest, prosecution, and death, millions of Americans have called for a full accounting: who was involved, who profited, and who covered for him. Despite public pressure, both major U.S. parties have repeatedly blocked or delayed the release of Epstein-related investigation files, citing victim protection, legal constraints, or political risk. A bipartisan minority in Congress, including Representative Thomas Massie, Republican Kentucky, and Ro Khanna, Democrat California, has launched a discharge petition to force a vote on the Epstein Files Transparency Act, aiming to declassify and release all DOJ records on Epstein. Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin accuses the Justice Department of a massive cover-up after a 2025 investigation into Epstein's network ended without new charges, despite survivors alleging at least 20 co-conspirators. The DOJ and FBI issued a memo in July 2025 stating they found no credible evidence of a client list implicating powerful third parties. The declaration has met with sharp skepticism. Meanwhile, Epstein's political and financial connections cross party lines. He donated to both Democrats and Republicans, maintained close relationships with major political figures, and had long-standing financial ties to top banks. Behind the partisan posturing, many of Epstein's survivors are united. They want the full truth, not a political theater. The legacy of Jeffrey Epstein. More than a scandal. Jeffrey Epstein died in a Manhattan jail cell on August 10, 2019, officially ruled a suicide. But his legacy refuses to fade. Epstein was a convicted sex offender, financier, and social predator, but also a man deeply enmeshed in elite circles, from banking to politics. He was not an isolated criminal. Investigations and reporting over decades revealed a network, underage girls, powerful associates, and suspicious arrangements. Even after his death, many believe the full story has never been told. Why Epstein matters? Because his story is not only about sex abuse, it's about systemic power, secrecy, and how institutions protect the wealthy and connected. Uncovering that story isn't a partisan jab, it's a matter of justice. A boomerang of political allegiances. Epstein's donations and who he gave money to. Epstein's financial footprint extended deep into political life. According to public records, he donated to both Democratic and Republican causes. From 1989 to 2003, Epstein gave over $139,000 to Democratic federal candidates and committees, and more than $18,000 to Republican ones. He gave $10,000 to refurbish the White House West Wing in the 1990s, a gift that reportedly earned him photographs with President Bill Clinton. His political giving was not token. By strategically investing in people and power, Epstein bought access. His network included not only politicians but financial giants, banks, tech moguls, and more. That web is precisely why many now demand full disclosure. Who among the elite was truly entwined with him? Banking ties and institutional complicity. Epstein's financial conduct came under scrutiny for years. One glaring connection. Deutsche Bank maintained dozens of accounts for Epstein over many years. Even after red flags in 2020, the bank paid a $150 million penalty for its failure to properly address Epstein's suspicious transactions. These banking ties raise deeply uncomfortable questions. Did major financial institutions enable Epstein? Did they report suspicious activity? And if so, why weren't criminal referrals made? These are not peripheral issues. They're central to understanding the scale and complicity of Epstein's operations. Key figures: Summers, Clinton, and other high-profile names. Epstein's connections were not limited to donations. He maintained relationships with highly influential people. Lawrence Summers, former Harvard president and U.S. Treasury Secretary, apparently flew on Epstein's private plane multiple times. Bill Clinton, never far from Epstein's orbit, their relationship has fueled decades of speculation and investigation. Epstein visited the White House, hosted fundraisers, and exchanged correspondence with major political figures. These affiliations raise serious concerns. Whether Epstein used his network not just for access, but for cover, and whether those in power helped shield him, the push for transparency, and the backlash the Epstein Files Transparency Act. In 2025, Congress saw a renewed, bipartisan push for Epstein-related transparency. The Epstein Files Transparency Act, H.R. 4405, introduced by Representative Ro Khanna, Democrat, California, would force the Department of Justice, DOJ, to declassify and disclose all Epstein-related investigation files. To make it happen, Representative Thomas Massie, Republican, Kentucky, joined Khanna in launching a discharge petition aimed at forcing a House vote even if Republican leadership resists. This is a bold step. Such petitions are rarely successful, but the measure underscores how deeply some lawmakers believe the case must be fully aired. Partisan roadblocks and hypocrisy. Despite bipartisan sponsors, the push has met fierce resistance. In September 2025, Senate Republicans blocked an amendment to the annual defense bill that would have compelled the release of Epstein files. The vote was 51-49. Senator John Thune, Republican, South Dakota, defended the move, arguing that the DOJ had already released tons of files and expressing trust in the department to protect victims' privacy. But critics say the refusal isn't about privacy, it's about power. Representative Ro Khanna has publicly challenged the argument that file release would harm victims, noting that his version of transparency legislation protects identities and excludes illegal content. He argues that the real resistance comes from leaders afraid of exposing who was truly connected to Epstein. To some, the bipartisan obstruction suggests more than bureaucratic caution. It looks like protection for the powerful. The cover-up accusations. Jamie Raskin's allegations. Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin, a member of the House Judiciary Committee, has been one of the sharpest vocal critics. In a letter to Attorney General Pam Bondi in 2025, he accused the DOJ of orchestrating a shameful and gigantic cover-up. Raskin argues that the investigation into Epstein's network was abruptly shut down, even as nearly 50 women identified as many as 20 co-conspirators. He says powerful leads were ignored and that the survivors deserve a full, transparent reckoning, not a half-story. What the DOJ says. In response, the DOJ and FBI released a memo stating they found no credible evidence of a client list implicating third parties, nor signs of a blackmail conspiracy. They also reaffirmed the official cause of Epstein's death as suicide, rejecting conspiracy theories. But the memo's conclusions have not satisfied critics. Many argue that it fails to address broader systemic questions. Were there hidden accomplices not yet charged? Were influential figures shielded? And if so, why? Subpoenas and congressional pressure. The House Oversight Committee, led by Republicans under Representative James Comer, has issued subpoenas for a long list of Epstein-related figures across both parties: Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, James Comey, and more. Comer says this isn't partisan, it's about accountability. But the partisan divisions are impossible to ignore. Some Republicans frame it as exposing hypocrisy on the left. Some Democrats view it as a serious probe into the corrupt entangling of politics and abuse. Partisan posturing. Who's playing, who's silent Trump's complex role? One of the most striking paradoxes, Donald Trump, once a friend of Epstein, now calls for investigations into Epstein's ties to Democratic figures. In November 2025, Trump publicly demanded that the DOJ and FBI investigate Epstein's connections to Bill Clinton, Larry Summers, Reid Hoffman, and even J.P. Morgan Chase. Attorney General Pam Bondi responded by naming a federal prosecutor, Jay Clayton, to lead the review. Trump framed his demand as exposing a hoax used by Democrats. But critics argue this may simply be a weaponization of the Epstein case for political ends. There's a risk. By framing Epstein as a partisan scandal, some are deflecting from deeper, systemic issues. GOP leadership's resistance. House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican, Louisiana, has publicly insisted he wants full transparency and accountability. "We want the full weight of the law on their heads," he said. Yet, when push came to shove, the House leadership avoided a vote on releasing files, even as some Republicans sided with Democrats in forcing a discharge petition. Critics argue that Johnson's statements are performative rather than substantive, a shield for his party's more endangered figures. Democratic ambivalence. Democrats, too, are deeply implicated. While some Democratic lawmakers, like Ro Khanna and Jamie Raskin, have pushed aggressively for full disclosure, others have been more cautious. PolitiFact reports that after Joe Biden became president in 2021, some Democrats dialed back their public calls for Epstein file release, citing deference to victims' legal processes and concerns over grand jury secrecy. Critics argue this reticence represents a deeper problem, protecting Clinton-era allies and shielding donors, rather than centering victims. The ethics at stake, beyond partisan theater. The Epstein files controversy is not just a political battle. It is a moral crisis with profound implications. For victims, justice, not soundbites. Many Epstein survivors have spoken out. They demand acknowledgement, transparency, and accountability, not only for Epstein himself but for those who enabled him. Some survivors publicly support the release of files, with redactions to protect identities. Khanna's legislation explicitly accounts for this. Others argue that without full disclosure, even of uncomfortable truths, there can be no collective reckoning. For them, this is not a partisan fight. It's about healing and truth. For democracy, trust in institutions. If Epstein's network extended into the political elite and financial institutions, the suppression or selective release of related files undermines public trust in justice and governance. When both parties block full disclosure or delay accountability, it fuels cynicism. Powerful people get protection. When investigations are weaponized partisanly, either as political theater or deflection, the original victim stories risk being overshadowed by conspiracy. This is not just about keeping documents sealed. It's about whether the public can believe in equal justice under the law. For power, unmasking collusion. Epstein's webs of influence, political, financial, social, represent a stark warning. Money and privilege can shield the worst crimes. Are bankers complicit? Did financial institutions ignore red flags to preserve lucrative relationships? Did powerful individuals step in to keep the darkest truths hidden? Were plea deals and cover-ups negotiated to silence rather than prosecute? Uncovering all these challenges, not just Epstein's memory, but the very infrastructure that allows money and power to evade accountability. The intellectual and strategic risk of silence when scandal becomes a political weapon. The Epstein case is becoming a bipartisan cudgel. Both sides are using it to score points, but neither side wants full transparency, because full transparency might expose their own vulnerabilities. For Trump and many Republicans, framing Epstein as a Democrat problem helps deflect. For some Democrats, slow-walking disclosure preserves relationships and avoids discomfort with longtime allies. This isn't surprising in partisan America, but it's deeply dangerous when justice is at stake. The distraction strategy. Recent analysis suggests a troubling pattern. When Epstein-related media coverage spikes, Trump and other leaders shift their messaging away from accountability and toward other topics. This strategic diversion risks reducing Epstein to a distraction, rather than confronting the real, systemic issues. If Epstein is allowed to become purely a political sideshow, without structural reform, his victims are the true losers. What must happen now? A framework for real accountability. To break the cycle, to serve justice rather than power, the following steps are essential. Release all files with protections. Enact the Epstein Files Transparency Act, H.R. 4405. Redact victim identities, but make investigations, evidence, and findings public. Provide secure access for journalists, scholars, and civil society. Independent, bipartisan commission. Create a commission, congressional or independent, to review Epstein's network, financial transactions, political ties, and institutional failures. Grant subpoena power, financial oversight, and a mandate to recommend reforms. Victim-centered process. Prioritize survivor testimony, reparations, and psychosocial support. Establish a dedicated fund for survivors, financed by the assets of Epstein's estate plus institutions implicated in enabling him. Financial and institutional reform. Launch investigations into banks, donors, and political actors linked to Epstein. Strengthen regulations for financial institutions on reporting suspicious activity. Ensure compliance is not optional. Public education and Transparency publish a public summary of findings, accountability measures, and recommendations, support civic education around power, privilege, and abuse, why Epstein was able to operate for so long, and how to prevent similar cases, risks and challenges partisan deadlock. Congressional divisions might block real reform, legal barriers. Some documents may remain sealed by court order, grand jury rules, or national security claims. Institutional resistance. Banks, political actors, and elites may fight commissions and disclosures. Victim reticence. Not all survivors want public exposure. Processes must be trauma-aware. Political backlash. Powerful people implicated may launch counternarratives, delay, or litigate. The nation's choice. This is no longer simply a scandal. It's a moral reckoning. For survivors, it's about truth, healing, and justice. For citizens, it's about whether institutions are accountable, whether power protects the powerful, or whether the law truly applies to everyone. For democracy, it's about trust. Can we believe the powerful will be held to account, or do they always shape the narrative? Both Republicans and Democrats now face a test. Not merely a political test, but an ethical one. Will they let Epstein's secrets die with him, or will they risk their own power, privilege, and reputations to finally expose the full truth? Because if the files stay sealed, the message to survivors, and to every citizen, is clear. In this country, some names are too big, some crimes too politically inconvenient, to ever come fully into the light.